Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. This week we will deal with a story that features David but is not well known. The story is found in 1 Samuel 27. In this section of the book, David has been on the run and living by his wits. Of course, he was not alone, for according to 1 Samuel 22, he had amassed a number of men who were running away themselves due to social distress, debt, or political discontent. This little group was a biblical band of brothers. The story in 1 Samuel 27 begins with David lamenting that Saul had been so relentless in chasing after him that he might soon run out of luck. Put simply, David had concluded that sooner rather than later he might die at Saul's hands. Keep in mind that Saul was still king. However, David had been anointed to succeed Saul as king. The tension between the two men could not have been more natural. That's in verse 1. Because of his fear, David decided to throw in his lot with the Philistines. The latter could also use some help with their military ventures. As muscle for hire, David would rent out his services to the Philistines. David is about to become a military mercenary. That's in verse 2. Of course, this would have the added benefit of getting Saul off his back. It was one thing to chase David and his men down while they were by themselves. It was quite another thing to do that if David and his men were allied with the Philistines. By this time, David led 600 men, a sizable force. That's in verse 3. He sought out Achish ben Maoch, who was king of Gath. Gath was one of 5 famous Philistine cities. David and his men, along with their families, and David's 2 wives, took up residence in Gath. When Saul heard about what David had done, the king called off the search for his nemesis David. That's in verse 4. Before long, David sat down with Achish to suggest an arrangement. He asked the Philistine king to allow David and his men and their families to live in one of the rural areas. David pointed out that Gath was a royal city and therefore not an appropriate place for him to live. Achish liked David's plan and consequently gave him the city of Ziklag. The narrator explains that this was the reason that Ziklag eventually became a city under the control of Judah and its Israelite kings. But for now, of course, it remained a Philistine territory. David and his little army ended up staying in the area controlled by the Philistines for 16 months. That's verses 5 through 7. There is no indication that Achish ever doubted David. The Philistine king thought David was completely sincere. A mutually beneficial political and military arrangement had transpired. What was not to like? David and his band went right to work. They made raids on Geshurites, Girzites, and Amalekites. These people had been around for a long time and inhabited large swaths of territory. But these raids were lethal. David saw to it that no witnesses were left. Men and women were slaughtered. Of course, this army also kept the spoils of war. They seized sheep, oxen, asses, camels, and even clothing. Because they were allied with Gath and its king Achish, David reported to the monarch. In his reports, David lied through his teeth. He told Achish that he had attacked He told Achish that when he attacked, that he had marched his forces against various peoples who lived in the Negev. David said that sometimes he raided the Negev of Judah, or the Negev of Israelites, or the Negev of the Kenites. That's in verse 10. The Negev is the southernmost portion of this area. These populations were either Israelite or people who had amicable relationships with Israelites. David's ploy could not have been more cynical. He attacked Israelite enemies and told the Philistine king that he was attacking Israelites or people sympathetic to them. Achish of Gath bought the story. He simply accepted what David said. This is why, the narrator informs us, that David left no witnesses among the peoples he had, in fact, attacked. The last thing he wanted to happen was for survivors to reveal the identity of the army that had devastated them. With no survivors, obviously there were no witnesses. It turns out that David followed this strategy the whole time he was allied with Achish and was living in Gath and then later on in Ziklag. He came upon Israelite enemies, put them to the sword, took their wealth, and made sure no one lived to tell the tale. The king of Gath swallowed David's lies, hook, line, and sinker. For Achish, what David was doing had an added benefit. By David's annihilating populations that were either Israelite or peoples friendly with Israel, David was ensuring that he could never be Israel's king. How could he ever sit on Israel's throne when it was widely known what he had done to Israel while allied with someone like the king of Gath? Achish reasoned that David's actions would certainly mean that he could count on David's loyalty in perpetuity. Of course, Achish's hope for David's continued loyalty would soon be dashed. This is because David had touched no one who was either Israelite or in friendly relationships with Israel. Indeed, he was going against peoples that were perpetual enemies of Israel, some of which would be Israelite targets when David became king. Achish, though, did not know that. David's bold-faced lies convinced him otherwise. This episode closed with the notation that Achish believed that, in light of David's military endeavors, he would be able to count on David's service from now on. Let's take a broader look at this story. One of its most striking features is that God does not appear at all. God does not speak. God does nothing. No prophet is around to provide perspective. For all practical purposes, this little story could not be more secular. Plus, how are David's genocidal actions justifiable? He wantonly killed off men and women. Somehow children are not mentioned, for the sole purpose of not leaving anyone around who could subsequently blow his cover. David deserves some sympathy for being on the run from Saul, who was trying so hard to get rid of the man anointed to be his successor. But surely that sympathy does not extend to his committing war crimes on this scale. David may also be congratulated for his clever political maneuver. Making it appear that he was allied with the Philistines while moving against Israelite enemies was little short of genius. But that move exacted a horrible cost. After all, in time, David would be considered Israel's ideal king. He would be called the sweet psalmist of Israel. He would be the one that God would elect to be Israel's perpetual king, as narrated in 2 Samuel 7. God would make an unconditional covenant with David and his descendants. How could not what he did in this episode not sully his reputation? Perhaps that is the point. It is commonly thought that the Old Testament has a pro-Judah bias. From one perspective, that is certainly true. At the same time, looking at David's story in its totality, not to mention what others in his line did, provides nuance to this so-called bias. Typically, we think that what David did when he had the affair with Bathsheba and then murdered her husband was his low point. But a story like the one narrated in 1 Samuel 27 suggests that David was no stranger to egregious behavior. Stories like this one cannot help but give us pause. It is for this reason that David is Israel's ideal king only in 2 Samuel chapters 21 through 24. In that text, we encounter a David who did not sin at all, as 2 Samuel 22 verses 21 through 25 indicate. The rest of the time, David is presented in a most unflattering light. Perhaps we forget this because we skim over the details of the whole biblical story. An episode like that found in 1 Samuel 27 exposes our own pro-David bias, a bias that is only possible by avoiding and forgetting about the biblical details. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Give me your email so I can contact you. If you have a question that you would like me to answer in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.